Well, good morning. Good to be with you all today as we continue our series on Live in La Vida Lutheran. Today we're going to be talking about a church and a faith for the people. But before I get into that, I want to think with you about a movie I love. I love kind of quirky movies. There's a Christmas movie that came out in the early 90s called The Nightmare Before Christmas. It's a weird one. It's claymation. It's Tim Burton. And it's kind of for kids, but kind of older kids because it's got a weird edge. But it's about in this world, there's different worlds of holidays, and like, so for Halloween it's Halloween Town, and all the kind of monsters and witches live there under their kind of king, their ruler, who's named Jack the Pumpkin King. And they're doing their thing, and they run Halloween, and they like doing that, but Jack kind of gets bored with what he's doing. He goes on this long walk and wanders into a different world, which is Christmas Town, or the North Pole, and he discovers the lights and the carols and the presents and the joy of Christmas, and he decides that he's going to, he means well, but he's going to do Christmas instead of Halloween, right? He wants to be part of that joy. And so there's these funny scenes where he's getting all his people ready for Christmas, but the problem is they don't understand it, right? So in the scene on Christmas Day when they start, they over the night he's giving all the presents out, and the kids open like a stocking and they pull out a spider, or they open up a present and there's like a duck, but then it opens its mouth with teeth and starts chasing. They just don't understand it because they're Halloween creatures, and Santa has to come and save the day. It's a cute movie, but it's that kind of thing where they unintentionally turn what was meant to be a blessing into a curse. And as human beings, we're kind of good at that sometimes, aren't we? That we take something that was meant to be good and we kind of warp it, or we have the wrong focus, we miss the forest for the trees, and we end up turning it into a burden, blessings into burdens. Well, as we continue our series on Live in La Vida Lutheran, we're talking about how the Lutheran tradition helped return the church and its message to the people. How Luther did that, how our tradition has helped to do that. And we can start by looking at the gospel reading, which comes across at first as this really harsh thing, right? Where Jesus is criticizing the religious leaders of his day. And it comes across maybe as just this negative message, but actually sometimes you have to be negative to be positive. He is criticizing the church because he wants, or it's not the church, it's the Jewish leaders at that time, but he's criticizing them because he wants the faith to be a blessing. He wants it to make people's lives better, and the way that many of these leaders are living it out, they're actually making it a burden. They're making it a struggle for people. He has a few specific criticisms. One of his criticisms is that these leaders are hypocrites, right? He has this line, do as they say, not as they do. So it's not so much that their teachings were ethically wrong in every way, but that they weren't living them themselves, right? So leaders who are hypocrites. He talks about, interestingly, how they tie heavy burdens to people. And what he's referring to was at this time, many of the leaders saw faith as this kind of laundry list of do's and do nots that just overwhelm people because it was such a long list. And you need to do this perfect, and if you mess up there, you have to do this, and blah, blah, blah. There wasn't much grace in it. It was about kind of living into faithfulness by following this incredibly long list that overwhelmed people. He talked about how they locked people out of the kingdom, right? That they had kind of this exclusionary worldview, this exclusionary message where everything was divided into righteous people who are friends of God and sinners who are just hopeless, right? And who need to be excluded. That's kind of how they divided the world. And then lastly, he talked about how their version of faith was really misfocused on external righteousness. In other words, the good things that people could see that weren't always that important. So how much you were at worship and how you dressed and maybe saying a prayer publicly, or they had these ritualistic washings. They would do all this stuff, burning incense. Not that they were bad things to do, but that they were neglecting the more important things, which was caring for people and justice and mercy and grace. And so Jesus criticizes this stuff, but then as you look in the rest of the Gospels, he's offering an alternative way to follow God, an alternative way to view God, to understand God, and to share God. And if we look at the church, especially the first few hundred years, no era of the church has ever been perfect. But there were lots of wonderful things that happened through it. He did give people this version of a God and this message that the early church preached of a God who forgave people their sins and who could offer hope, especially to people who were kind of kicked out of society and told that they're nothing and told that they don't belong. Christianity was one of the few places that was showing them love. One of the ways they did this was work towards justice, especially for the poor and vulnerable. You'll often hear in the Bible about caring for orphans and widows. These happen to be two of the most vulnerable groups of that day, and the church was famous in the early period for caring for people who were vulnerable. And then the other thing they did that goes along with this stuff is that it was one of the few organizations, probably really the only one at this time, which brought people together despite where they were from. So, they could be rich or poor, they could be servants, they could be royals, they could be young and old, men and women. This message that we're all one in the body of Christ was pretty revolutionary, right? People were very separate in their little pockets of society. And so really Jesus' intention and what we see in much of the early period was a faith that was of the people and for the people. Well, however, if you fast forward hundreds and hundreds of years to the time of Luther, about the year 1500, a lot of that kind of feel had been lost. And the institutional church, I don't want to say there weren't great individual Christians, but the institutional church, the hierarchy, had really gotten stuck in corruption and a disconnection from the people. And as Lutherans, we often tell this story a lot. I won't get into it too much, but we've all heard the message how they were selling forgiveness, literally, right? So the more money you had, the more forgiveness you could get. Being a bishop or like a priest was a really nice position back then. I don't know how many people think being a pastor is cool now, but in an area where lots of people were peasants and poor, being a bishop, you owned land and palaces. They lived as royals, and so they would literally sell these positions to the highest noble bidder. Some of the popes became pope because they were the richest family, and they would literally kind of buy and bribe their way into the position. And then finally, and maybe the biggest thing, was the God that the church painted for people was this angry tyrant who was just looking to throw you in hell, or if not hell, then purgatory, which was like next to hell. It was really bad, and you had to burn for a long time until you can go to heaven. And so Luther's big goal in the Reformation, it wasn't just to return the message to truth. He did want to do that. He wanted to recover the gospel. But it was also returning it to the people, right? Giving them a faith that was not just a burden, that was a blessing to them. And he did this in lots of ways, and the reformers did. But I want to share three of them today with you, three big ways that he brought the church back to the people. And the first one I want to share with you is that he made the church understandable to people at a time where it wasn't. Some of you know that my wife and I had the chance during my pastoral internship for a year to live in Egypt, and we served at a church in Cairo. And it was, I like all the communities I've been part of. I love this one. I also loved something about that one, which was that we were part of an incredibly diverse community. We had people from all over the world, people from like Brazil and France and England and the US and Canada and Africans and Asians, all kind of people coming together. It wasn't a big church, but coming together in this little community. And the reason they came together with us was an interesting thing. If you look at Egypt and the Christians who are there, they're called Coptic Christians, which just means Egyptian Christians. They're a beautiful, wonderful tradition, but they've been persecuted for many years. So one of their things is really being strong in their community and their identity. But the language they worship in is Coptic, which is a pre-Arabic language. And it's kind of like Latin. It's not a language anyone speaks anymore except for in the Coptic community in their church. And so going back to the church I served, the reason we had so many people in our church from all over was people could understand the church service, right? Because if you go to a Coptic service, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's great for them, but you probably won't understand much of what's going on. Well, English isn't everyone's first language, but it's lots of people's second language. So because they could understand it, they wanted to be part of our community. Well, by the time Luther came along, you may know, church was done only in Latin. The Bible, the sermon, the liturgy, everything was Latin. Except for by this time, over hundreds of years of evolution had happened in language, and no one spoke Latin anymore. So for common people, they had no idea what the Bible said or what was going on in their service in a specific way. The language had changed, but the church refused to. In fact, many in the church, the kind of hierarchy, had this idea that like Latin was God's language, right? That God just likes Latin more than other languages, and so we cannot ever change from it, even if the people don't understand. And in fact, many of the hierarchy figured that the people don't need to understand. The priest will tell them and will give you kind of what you need, and you just don't worry about having an understanding of God yourself. We'll tell you what you need to know. Well, Luther came along and he said this is crazy, right? That the gospel was meant to be understood and embraced by everyone and shared by everyone. And so it's vital that people actually understand what's happening in their faith. So he translated the Bible into German, which had never been done up to that point. And once the churches reformed and split off, they started having worship in German. And people actually started having ideas about who God was. And that was a beautiful thing because of these reforms of making their faith understandable. So that was the first one. The second thing Luther did to bring the church back to the people was he offered them a God that actually made their lives better and more full of grace rather than full of burden and fear. So it's interesting how, going back to Jesus today, how he criticizes religious leaders for burdening people with heavy loads. And as I shared, kind of their form of faith was a God who's angry at you and trying to punish you, and so you have to do all these things in order to be acceptable. And Luther saw the same thing in his church, just this never-ending list of spiritual gymnastics that people had to perform in order to be good enough to be loved by God. And so, by this time, most people were terrified of God, right? God is this angry tyrant who wants to put me in hell and purgatory if I don't shape up in all these given ways. Well, Luther comes along, and it's not that he says there's no do's or do-nots in faith, right? There's still ethics, there's still a way we should live, of course. But he does say that the church had forgotten to say that the first and last line of faith is Jesus' I love you to the world while we're still sinners, right? That there can be lots of other stuff we can talk about, lots of spirituality, lots of guidance of how we live our life, but that if you don't get the I love you at the beginning and at the end and really all the way in the middle, that none of the rest matters. It reminds me of being a parent. And when you have kids, you love them, but sometimes they do stupid things and they get in trouble and they fight and they do stuff that they shouldn't. And sometimes you have to go into the mode of telling them you were wrong, or here's what you need to do. Sometimes you even might have to get them in trouble or punish them. And that might all be necessary and good. But I know for my parenting, the day has to start with an I love you and the day has to end with an I love you, because that's the foundation. And all the guidance you could give them in the world, if they don't get the foundation, that they're loved by their parent, then none of the other stuff really matters. Well, that's the same idea for the church that Luther wanted to offer the church, that God's main word to us is a word of love. And all the other stuff can come into, but it starts and ends with a word of love, which frees us from this version of faith, which is just a cycle of fear and guilt. So that was the second thing. And then the last thing is that Luther returned the church to the people by insisting that everyone is part of God's mission, and not just like special people who wear collars or wear robes, not just people, saints on stained glass windows, but everyone can be part of God's mission. At the time of his, when he was growing up in the church divided the world into kind of people who were very much part of the ministry of Christ. We're talking like the Pope and saints and clergy and monks and nuns. Right? They did the work of the church. And then everyone else, right? Farmers and shopkeepers and peasants who weren't really seen as very much part of it. And the idea was that ministry professionals, kind of like I shared earlier, we'll give you what you need, we'll give you communion, and you guys just support it by giving your money and showing up. But again, you're not too much part of ministry, was the idea. Well, Luther had this brilliant idea that he called the priesthood of all believers, which is this idea that, yes, some people are called to publicly lead the church, pastors and other types like that, but that actually everybody who's a Christian is called into the mission of God. And if you're a janitor, you can be a janitor and convey the love of God. If you're a teacher, a nurse, or a student, or old or young, or man or woman, everyone has a role in the mission of God, because everyone in their life, both their work life and their home life, can either convey the love of God or not. And so it's this beautiful thing where no longer do you just have to be sitting around and waiting for someone to do church for you, but that you're actually part of what's happening in the church. And that kind of brings us to today. I've talked a lot about things that were happening and things that Luther did 500 years ago to help the church grow and return to its mission. But that's now our mission, right? That we're the people who are called to make the church understandable, right? To not get caught up with petty things about, oh, God only likes this way or God only likes that. We don't just have a message, but we want people to understand it. So how do we make our communities understandable to people so that they can know a loving God? How do we introduce them to a God that actually makes their life better? Sure, there's ethics and there's ways we could live, but how do we make sure that the love of God is the front and center of what we do? And lastly, how do we help people feel involved? How do we make sure that they know that church isn't something that someone does for them, but that they are part of the ministry? They are the body of Christ too. It's a wonderful calling, a wonderful thing to be Lutheran, to be part of this tradition where we have a God who's for the people and of the people, and that we have a church that is for the people and of the people and by the people. So let us live in that blessing all of our lives. Amen.
Amen.